Occasionally, another after effect that we see, and I've only seen 3 cases of this, so I suspect it's very rare, and that is occasionally someone will come out of a near-death experience inspired to artistic creation. People who never in their lives have taken up a paintbrush or whatever will suddenly come out of this and say that in their experience they received a very definite impression that they were to get busy painting. One of these men is named Andy Lakey in California, who had an experience like this some years ago and now has become a very accomplished artist whose art is sought all over the world. In the years since I got interested in this and first published on this about 25 years ago, there have been many other studies of this done, again, all over the world. And this near-death experience thing is a team effort, very definitely. My book never would have gone anywhere if it hadn't been for my many colleagues all over the world who read this and then began to ask among their own patients and so on. Dr. Kenneth Ring, who was a professor of psychology, recently retired from the University of Connecticut at Storrs, has again interviewed thousands of these people, I'm sure, over the years, and has made a special study, very interestingly, over the past few years of the near-death experiences of people who were blind. And I wish I could tell you more about that. Ken's book is soon to be published on that, and I'm really looking forward to that. I had only one case that I know of directly in which a person who was apparently blind had a seemingly visual near-death experience. Dr. Melvin Morse, who's a pediatrician in Washington and also pediatricians in Europe and I'm sure other places by now, have studied near-death experiences in children. And we know that even very young children have experiences like these when they're on the verge of death. Dr. Morse has some fascinating drawings that the kids that he's talked with who went through this experience drew for him, showing these same themes that we hear from adults in graphic way. Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, again has studied this for years, far more systematically than I have. And Bruce is an emergency psychiatrist, so he has a large number of cases of people who had near-death experiences when they came close to death as a result of a suicide attempt. And he has found out a very interesting fact, and that is that whereas the people who come close to death from some other reason or cause, compared to, I'm sorry, I misspoke myself on that. He's compared 2 groups of people in that situation. He studied suicide attempters in his hospital and then divided them into 2 groups. One were those people who attempted suicide, survived, and in the interim had a near-death experience. And then another group of patients who, in that same circumstance of attempting to kill themselves, did not have a near-death experience. Then he followed these groups over a long period of time and has found that whereas the people who did not have a near-death experience in connection with their suicide attempt continue to have a high rate of subsequent attempts at self-destruction, the people who have a near-death experience in those circumstances will have essentially a 0 rate of further suicidal attempts. And what he says about that is that the near-death experiences of suicide attempters are the same as those of people who come close to death in other circumstances. But that the people who have these experiences will say that after their suicide attempt and having this experience, they learn from their experience that life has a purpose and that it's not so easy to get away, so that it gives them the courage to stay and to face these difficulties. A lot of questions come up about this, and obviously as a psychiatrist I've reflected on this a lot over the years. And what I finally came to as my latest understanding of suicide is this, that when you're in practice and you see such a broad sweep of human phenomena that present themselves as suicide attempters, from people who on the one hand are just doing it for dramatic effect, and then people people, on the other hand, who are just terribly depressed from some biochemical reason. I mean, it's such a broad sweep of human experience that what you get to on the end of that spectrum is self-destructive behavior. And what I find about that is that that lets all of us in, right? I mean, I'm doing it with cholesterol. And so I feel over the years that it's really kind of an artificial distinction to say, well, you know, this person's experience might be different because they attempted suicide. I mean, you know, suicide is something we're all doing to some degree. And I think God's not going to be fooled. You know, it's like you do it over 20 years as opposed to just a few minutes. You're working on a time scale of billions. Well, we seem to be learning that these experiences are really fairly common. And a Gallup poll was done in about 1979 or 80, which said at that time that there were about 8 million Americans who had been through this sort of thing. And other studies as well have indicated that this is fairly common. We don't know exactly what percentage of people who come close to death, say from a cardiac arrest, will have something like this happen to them. And when I started out, I assumed it was very low. I had always assumed in the early years it had to be under 5%. But in fact, the studies that have been done systematically suggest that it's higher than that. Some people say up to a third. A study, I believe, in Holland, about a third of the people who get resuscitated will recall something like this. Why some do and some don't is just a mystery. There are all kinds of factors that you could consider, but really nobody knows. One thing I want to digress here for a moment about is this, that I've seen this phenomenon develop over the last 25 years to something that was not at all in the public awareness, to 25 years later something that almost everybody knows about. And in connection with that, I've seen a development that just really troubles me deeply, and that is that the sensationalism that the publishers are promoting about this, and I want to preface this by saying that I am not a cynical person. I need more cynicism than I have, according to my friends. You know, when you see these books that are just stamped out with this scientific evidence of life after death and so on, these things, shoddy stuff that's put out now, and I'm sorry to have to say this, folks, but it's just my perception in seeing the publishing industry over the last 20 years. I'm sorry to have to say it, but it really appears to me that these people really don't have much regard for the truth, that what they're interested in is selling books. And even my own book, I've been arguing with my publishers for 20 years, and finally just a couple of years ago gave them an absolute ultimatum: take that off the cover where it says proof of life after death. And you just wouldn't believe how these people can engineer, no matter what you do or what you write, they can distort it around to make it, to make it look sensationalized. And what I keep trying to tell these people is something they don't seem to be able to get through their head, but it's nonetheless true. You don't have to sensationalize this stuff. It's sensational on the face of it. If you make it, if you sensationalize it, that just makes it seem hokey. But they don't get. So I have pretty much abandoned my connection with those big publishers. I think the smaller ones, though, you can talk to them. But I think there's an inbuilt corrective to this sensational trend that I see with that, and that is that almost everybody knows somebody who's been through this experience. And really, the best way to learn about this is not by hearing me talk about it, or hearing some other person who you don't know talk about it. The best way you can learn about this is hearing this from Uncle Hanford or Aunt Florine or somebody that you know and love. And if that seems unrealistic, well, I wouldn't know anybody of that category. I can guarantee you do. I mean, statistics alone, there's somebody that you know fairly closely who has been through this. they are not likely to be upfront with this information, even in the present context of general acceptance of this sort of thing. And if you hear it from your aunt or your grandfather or somebody that you've known in another context and you trust their judgment, then it sinks in, I think, in an entirely different way, rather than through the head channel, through the heart channel in a very different way. And I would encourage you all to give that a try, and to not take this on authority, but rather try to hear this from somebody that you know personally. Another thing is happening with this now that is going to change, my guess is, and I don't like to make projections, but I feel fairly commonly about this, fairly strong about this. I feel that within the next 5 or 10 years, we will see our perceptions of death change in a way that is just as dramatic as we've seen over the last 25 years with the near-death experience. Because there's a new wrinkle in the near-death experience that's reaching tidal wave proportion now that I find just absolutely fascinating. And this change of the phenomenon is brought about by two factors. One is, as I mentioned before, the aging of the baby boomers, so that we're in a position now where we're losing relatives and so on. And secondly, in connection with that, there's been a dramatic change in hospital practice. When I started out in medical school in '72, at that time, the practice was that when a person was dying, the doctors and nurses would come in and they would usher the family out under our feeling that, well, this is too overwhelming for the family. And so the family wouldn't be there for the terminal events. But now the change is dramatic that I've seen, that now it's much more common that the doctors and nurses at that point will make themselves scarce. And the family is encouraged to stay there at the bedside of their dying loved ones. And in connection with that now, we're seeing an entirely new wrinkle in this, which I labeled, for want of a better term, the empathic death experience. And by that I mean that, and I've checked this out with numerous colleagues, Stan Groff, Ken Ring, Bruce Grayson, and others who agree to this, that it's very common for bystanders at the bedside of a dying loved one that as that person in the bed passes us away, the bystanders will have all of these features that we've come to associate with the near-death experience in a way that the bystanders interpret to be an empathic co-living of the dying experience of that person in the bed. And I think every feature of the near-death experience I've heard also from bystanders. People will say, for example, that as their mother died, they themselves felt themselves leave their body. They looked, and down below they could see their own body standing along beside the deceased body of their mother. Then they would turn their attention to the side and they would see their mother out of her body, they say, passing upward. Often they describe at this point seeing relatives or friends who have already passed away, that person coming to greet that person. And a very common account of this is that then the mother sort of recedes toward this light into this tunnel, and the person there standing at the bedside will come back down and rejoin their body. But I've heard two cases now of people, both mothers who lost sons, who said that they were there at the death experience of their sons, and both participated in the panoramic life review of their sons. Really fascinating. And one reason that this is so intriguing and puzzling, I think, is that it's natural to wonder, well, is this a product of the chemical changes in the brain and so on? But if that's so, why does the essentially the same experience take place to people who are not physiologically compromised in that circumstance? Just absolutely